on the line with Matthew Jones, who is a researcher in the Department of Theatre at the University of Toronto. And I just wanted to find a little bit more about Matthew Jones, but as it were, too many things going on. Matthew Jones is a writer, an activist, a teacher, and a researcher on the politics of war, terrorism, and race in performance. And I think that's really fantastic, the way that Matt is looking at performance. So, hello, Matt.
Hi, Alnor. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, you know what? Thank you so much for agreeing to come on at such short notice and for the interesting work that you do. I just find it absolutely phenomenal. So I came by your work because I also am interested in the topic of anti-terrorism and so on. And I just found this whole take that you have on political performance really fantastic. So your dissertation is titled "The Shock and Awe of the Real: Political Performance and the War on Terror." And could you just bring our listeners a little bit up to speed about, well, for one thing, Matt, what drew you to this particular research topic? And then maybe talk a little bit about your dissertation, what you looked at, and a little bit around the methodology that you employed.
Sure. Okay, I'd be glad to. Well, I just want to say that it's great to be speaking after Eve Engler. I think he's doing such great work on many of these same questions, and we found ourselves in similar circles over the last almost 20 years organizing against Canada's role in war and imperialism. So I wish I'd written as many books as Eve has. But,
we all do, right?
yeah, exactly. I'll tell you a bit about what I'm working on right now, which is a book project that's based on the dissertation, and it's called "The Body at War: Necro-Performance and the Global War on Terror." So really what I was doing is looking at a couple of tendencies that I was seeing in that are sort of parallel between how contemporary war is run and the way that artists respond to that. And so what I mean by that is like that today war is always a kind of performance, right? It's a scripted event. It's the people who wage war are very media savvy. They're conscious of how it will be reported, and in many ways, a war is an attack on the way that reality is constructed and perceived. So if you think about the invasion of Iraq way back in 2003, the kind of ideas that people like Donald Rumsfeld in the Bush administration had talked about a campaign of shock and awe, right? That is supposed to destabilize Iraqis so that they're left in a kind of fog and they don't know what's going on. They don't know what's real anymore. And then within that fog, the invading army is going to come in and offer guidance, right? This is the only solution. You must, accept this, except in this case, American leadership. So I'm interested in those, as someone who's trained in the language of performance and understanding how performance operates, I'm interested in trying to see how those tools might help us to understand war today. And then the second aspect of that is the way that artists themselves have been responding to wars. And here there's a parallel because in the work that I look at by performance artists and theater artists, they're not just criticizing the violence of war, and they're not just responding to the hypocrisies of warmongers, but they're often attacking this whole structure of a kind of, as I was saying, like a media attack on what we understand reality to be. And this is what James Dedurian has called the military-industrial media entertainment network. So this sort of constellation of forces in media and government and entertainment, that Yves was describing very articulately when he was talking about the way that Canada's history of imperialist intervention and warfare has been has been rewritten by a propaganda machine that is still active and that is still trying to paint a rosy picture of Canadian military intervention. So that's sort of where it started, from these associations between how artists are responding and how war is working. And it also came out of activism that I've been doing, thinking back quite a long ways now to the times of the Iraq and Afghan wars beginning in 2002, 2003. I was in Montreal. I was involved in a few different groups. There's a big coalition called the Collectif Échec à la Guerre, which organized those massive protests in Montreal, and some other smaller student-based coalitions that were formed even on September 11th or 12th of 2001 to organize some kind of response to the racism and the drive to war that 9/11 unleashed in the country. And then some other work around supporting American soldiers who were trying to flee the American army and come to Canada and seek refuge, and we were trying to apply some pressure to allow them to stay and not be sent back where they were imprisoned. So it comes out of that, and then I was also doing theater. So it comes from all of those things sort of coming together into a project.
It's interesting. So the performativity of war itself as a state performance, and then looking at performances based on that performativity. Right. So give us a sense of the scope of the work that you entertained or that you analyzed. Talk to us a little bit about the method, or even now as you're extending it into your book projects, the methods that you're using to go about doing your collection and then eventually analysis.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a great question. In terms of a scope, I deliberately kept to a very wide scope, looking at artists working in different spaces around the world. Largely, I was interested in artists from the Iraqi and Afghan diasporas as they're thinking through ways to respond to what's happening to the country that they're from. And in many cases, the artists I was looking at were based in the United States or Canada or the UK, and so they're really caught in the center of this conflict, where there's a whole discourse of war that is demonizing people of their identity and people back home, and so they're sort of caught in that, but they've also left that place, and so they don't fully identify with it either, and that being stuck in the middle, is that classic exile state of not having a clear identity on either side. What I'm doing in the newer version, the book project, is I'm borrowing an idea from the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe, and he develops this theory that he calls necro-politics. So necro, like death, linked to politics, and really what he's interested in here is what are those conditions in today's world in which the state needs to kill, like it needs to destroy human bodies in order to maintain its power. And I think that this is a crucial idea. So Mbembe, he traces this through a number of historical situations like plantation slavery, apartheid colonialism, Palestine, the war in Iraq, and what I'm doing is, in what I'm calling necro-performance, is kind of adding the performance element to that, and seeing how performance is a part of how a state intervenes to create death and to legitimize death of certain populations. So we could think of one example of that is a declaration of war. In a declaration of war, I state something, I perform a sentence, and a state of violence is created between us that legitimizes the death of somebody. But in today's world, states don't often actually declare war. Like the war in Iraq, it was never formally declared. It was just sort of done, and often retroactively justified. So I'm interested in how the language works like that to create what Mbembe calls a death world, right? A space in which a population is condemned to destruction in order to justify the violence of a state. In this case, I'm thinking about the violence of the American state invading Iraq and Afghanistan. And I also look at how this happens in law. So that's we were chatting a bit about this article that I was writing about Omar Khadr, where I cited your excellent work. And here I'm interested in how there is what I call a performative gap in the law. So, law in Canada is supposed to be, free and equal. We all have equal access to the law. We all have rights. But I'm interested in what has to be done in order to suspend the rights of a certain population, and how is performance a part of that, right? How do state actors, politicians, lawyers perform, in court, in the media, in everyday life, in a way that makes it legitimate to remove the civil rights of a population? So that's sort of where I see Omar Khadr getting trapped, right? Mm-hmm. In this gap that is opened up by lawmakers who argue that there's a reasonable case for the suspension of the rights to, in this case, a child who's caught in a war zone. Mm-hmm. So I look at that in terms of actual war, and then I'll just talk a little bit maybe about some of the artists that I'm interested in.
Yeah, because Matt, I also wanted to get into that. You write in your abstract, at least in your dissertation, that the playwrights crafted scripts from real worlds of soldiers instead of writing plays, in a sense blurring this line between performativity or hyperreality. So when you talk a little bit about some of the artists that you had engaged with in your work, can you unpack that for us as well?
Okay, yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with a performance artist from the United States, Iraqi-American artist named Wafa Bilal. And so what I'm interested in the dissertation, I have a chapter called Real Bodies, and it's about artists who are using their own physical bodies, and they're putting their bodies in harm's way, or sometimes they're deliberately harming their bodies as a way of showing the visceral violence that the war is creating. And in the new project, I'm thinking about that as a kind of necro-performance, as a kind of performance of somebody who is marked for death by the state as a member of this target community. And so what Wafa Bilal did in his piece, he was, this is in, I think, 2005 in Chicago. He had just lost his father and his brother to American strikes in Iraq. And he was feeling the sort of the culture of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism that was so prominent in the United States in the early 2000s. So he created a play that was called, very provocatively, Shoot an Iraqi. And so what he did was he's a performance artist. So he put himself in a museum for 30 days, and he didn't leave the museum. He slept there. He ate there. He showered there. Everything, and he set up a paintball gun. And so you could come into this museum and you could shoot him at any time. But then he also made it possible to operate this paintball gun remotely, so via an internet chat forum. And so you could so now it's open to everybody, right? And people can log in from anywhere with any motivation and just shoot the guy. So what he's doing is he's putting his body on the line and performing that phenomenon of living a kind of social death that happens in this kind of racist climate, right? Where people with bodies like his are becoming targets on the street. And for me, it's a really fascinating topic because, I think it's one thing to do this in a gallery, and you might get a certain, crowd who like understands what's going on and maybe sort of playfully engages with it. But as soon as you open it to this online audience, I mean, it's just anybody, right? And you can imagine the kind of people who show up and think this is a great idea. Like they've been dying to shoot an Iraqi, and they now have a forum where they can express their ideas about this, and they have an act they can do. They can physically shoot him with this paintball gun.
Yeah, I mean, he's asking for it, so
I'm
being facetious. I'm just joking around. It reminds me of an article that I had read again of a person. I think he was from an Arab background. Shortly after 9/11 and the heavy surveillance that was occurring on the Muslim population there, decided to implant a microchip in his head that would directly give his coordinates out. I don't know why he didn't just stick with his cell phone, but again, a performance and to just sort of get it out there. I mean, so these are the kinds of things that you're talking about when you say that people who are performing this are putting their bodies in harm's way. Yeah, it's very interesting. Talk to us a little bit. Talk to us more about some of the other participants in your study or some of the other subjects that you engaged with.
Yeah, so a key space that I spend a lot of time thinking about is Guantanamo Bay. Because this is really a space where it's kind of the extreme end of this process of marking certain bodies as worthy of death, right? Of stripping people of all rights, right? The whole and again, there's a linguistic performance in even doing that, right? Donald Rumsfeld and the Bush legal team.
Oh, right, they did come up with these terms, didn't they? Yes,
that's right. Yeah, exactly. All these euphemisms.
Yes, right? Enemy combatant or whatever it was.
Yeah,
I mean, there are others.
So enemy combatant, extraordinary rendition, and
right. Exactly.
All these kinds of things.
All of this is like a Gumban's work, isn't it, with the Homo sacer and all of that stuff? Really coming out to play. Yeah.
So I draw on that, but yeah, I mean, the point is to have people who are not prisoners of war, and so they're not protected by prisoners of war conventions, and they're also not detained on U.S. soil, so they don't get the rights that anyone who is detained in the U.S. would get, even without being a citizen. So they really have nothing. So it's a really clear example of this, of Mbembe's idea of necropolitics and the state, just pushing people not to death exactly, but just to a moment before that, where they're at their minimum ability to be alive. And one extreme example of this is where the detainees at Guantanamo decide to assert their, to protest the injustice that they're facing, to demand, fair trials. And so they go on a hunger strike. And this happened many, many times over the years at Guantanamo. There were many hunger strikes. And most conventions, Geneva Convention among others, argue that you should not feed a hunger striker, right? That's too much of an imposition on somebody's autonomy, right? To force feed them. So of course they do this at Guantanamo, and the way that they do it is really fascinating because there are these medics that they find, army medics, who are scared that they'll have their medical licenses revoked. So they take off all of their name tags, and they replace those name tags. And you're not going to believe this, but they replace their name tags with fake names taken from Shakespeare plays.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like the weirdest it's the weirdest move. But I think it makes sense in there's a few ways to understand it. First of all, I think that there's like a culture of performance in the kind of torture that happens at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, and we see this in the photographs that emerged, right? That everybody is playing to each other, right? They're trying to impress each other. They're trying to derive this kind of dark pleasure from the way that they perform. And I think to take on the names of Shakespeare, it doesn't mean that these medics were big fans of Hamlet or anything like that. But I think it's an argument about civilization. It's saying I am not just a medic. I'm a medic that comes from Euro-American culture that produced Shakespeare, and so I'm superior to you. And you don't even get this joke, So there is this very kind of twisted performance going on that is very similar to kinds of performances that we're seeing in plantation slavery and in other even more extreme examples of political violence. So anyway, so what I look at in the dissertation is a protest video created by the rapper Mos Def, or also known as Yasin Bey, where he tries to reenact the process of being force fed, and so you can look this up on YouTube. Actually, it's still there. So he sits down on a bed. There's a medical team. They have these tubes that you stick up your nose, and then you feed them down into the person's stomach, and then you pour, an Ensure milkshake down their throat. And at Guantanamo, they deliberately had very thick straws so that it would hurt as it went. It would hurt as the straw was going down, and it would also it could take hours to force feed you. So you're restrained on a chair. It looks kind of like an electric chair. Like your head is restrained, your arms are restrained, your legs are restrained, this kind of thing. So the video is really fascinating. It's hard to watch because he's really, you can really see the amount of suffering that this creates. And what happens, if I can give a spoiler, is that although he's very committed to this, he wants to show solidarity with these people who have had their rights taken away and who he identifies with at some level. He's not able to go through it with it in the end. He starts crying. He pulls the thing out of his nose, and the video just kind of ends here. And then it says, this is happening every day in Guantanamo. And I think it's another good example of this idea of necropolitics, or necro-performance, of artists who are, they're willing to hurt themselves. They're willing to harm their bodies. They're willing to suffer because they're making a point about another kind of suffering that is so much bigger, right? And they're trying to find a way for us to sort of, live with the fact that great injustices go on and great acts of violence are going on, and that we need to find small ways to draw attention to those injustices, and that sacrifice may be something that they're willing to do as well. That they're willing to sacrifice their bodies to some small degree, right? To bring that to light.
Wow, I just find your work extremely fascinating. Can you let listeners know where they can get more information on you? Maybe share your blog with them.
Sure. So I have a little website that it's mattjones.space. So mattjones.space, and there you can link to all of my stuff, and some of my writing is there, and there's a link to the blog on that website.
Okay. Well, Matt, we're running out of time. Otherwise, I'd love to talk to you more about your postdoc, but I'm going to invite you back, and I hope that we can catch up and talk not only about your postdoc work, which is an extension of the work that we just talked about, but some of the other work that you've been doing around social justice and activism and just supporting communities. So we're going to just have to...
That'd be a real pleasure.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it here then, Matt. Thank you for joining us for the first time and not the last on Co-op Radio. And once again, I just believe that your work is just absolutely phenomenal. This whole idea of performativity and how it's been taken up, especially by artists of affected communities, I think is really, really fascinating. I look forward to knowing more about it. So thanks a lot. Have a good evening.